The shutdown drags on, and here's an interesting surprise. While people might think this is solely a federal problem, among the entities that are struggling the most with the closure are, in fact, the 50 separate United States. How in our federalist system did our local governments become so dependent on federal dollars? What's that mean for governance? And what are the Trump administration and some states doing to change that trajectory?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a weekly podcast for the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. And joining me this week to explain this increasingly blurred federal-state division is Tony Woodlief, Senior Executive Vice President at the State Policy Network, Senior Fellow for SPN's Center for Practical Federalism, and one of the authors of a new report on state dependency on D.C. Welcome, Tony. Thank you so much for coming on this week.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
So I'm excited because this is one of my favorite topics, although also one that immensely frustrates me. This flip-flop between states and the federal government with regard to the jobs they do, the taxes we pay, the entity that we look to for dealing with our policy issues. I remember the great Milton Friedman writing that up until about 1930, and this blows people's minds, federal spending was usually less than 5% of national income because the federal government was largely a referee that only dealt with big things like military or monetary policy, whereas state and local government taxes were often 2 to 3 times that amount, that percentage, because they dealt with everything else. Now we have this situation where it's all back to front. Right. The majority of taxes go to the feds, who do way too much, and then who then decide how to hand that money back out to the states. So just to start, you're the expert here. Can you give us a sense how dependent these days are states on the Fed for their revenue, and how has that changed in recent years, in particular since COVID?
Well, yeah, I think no, you're right. You've had this upward trend in dependency. So around 1990, the average state got about 18% of its total revenue from federal agencies. And the most recent data shows that now it's 37%.
Wow.
And you've got several states, it's well over 40%. And, Louisiana, it's 52%. So, of course, some of that's formula driven. There's a lot of kind of formulaic programs. But the reality is this is the cause of the present crushing federal debt. John Cogan, who's a Hoover scholar, he ran the numbers and he said, look, if you had confined the federal government to its enumerated powers, so the things it's allowed to do by the Constitution, and you throw in Social Security, and you throw in Medicare, add all that up. If it only did that, our federal debt today would be zero.
Wow.
All that debt is because the federal government is pressed into areas that it doesn't do well at all. It's just expensive and it's bankrupting us.
Yeah, I want to go through that. I mean, I wanted to ask and kind of have you single out a couple of players here, because first of all, let's just say for a baseline, one thing your report makes clear is every state is bad. Okay. Literally every state other than Idaho and New Mexico received a higher share of revenue from the federal government in 2023 than they did prior to the pandemic. But you guys actually single out some of the worst offenders and also some of the least offenders in terms of those who take lesser money. Yeah. What are those states, and what are some of the reasons that some are more dependent than others?
Well, yeah. So some of it will be formula. So if you have more poverty in your state, however the federal government defines that, you're going to have more dollars flowing in just based on things like Medicaid expenditure and SNAP, which is the nutritional, that's food for the poor.
Food stamps. Yep.
Right. So that's going to be some of the driver. And so you have, at the same time, there's a couple things going on. One is states have perfected the art of getting every dollar they can out of DC. In some cases, like the state of Florida, you'll find in statute for things governing like their transportation system, they're not even shy about it. They say, essentially, our job here is to maximize federal dollars flowing to the state.
No shame.
None at all. You have, our friends at Paragon Health, Brian Blaze, they've talked about the sort of 50-state Medicaid fraud where states are complicit in driving up that spend because of the a massive reimbursement. So that's a driver. But some states have, as you pointed out, they've gotten far worse. There's about 23 states that are getting more of their budget now from the federal government than they did during the height of the shutdowns, that was the excuse, right? We got to push all this money out of Washington or else the country's
in COVID. Right.
and so, yeah, they keep plateauing, and it's like an addiction. And many of those states, they turn around and they cut their own taxes. I mean, these are states often run by people who call themselves conservative, but there's nothing conservative about taking the money and sending it to Washington so they can pick the winners and losers, and they send some of it back. That's it's lunacy. And now you end up with this dependency and vulnerability because these very same states have no idea which of their programs are dependent on federal aid in what ways because the budgeting is so terrible.
Well, I mean, and again, you just hit on one of my big issues. It drives me as we talk a lot about how we need to make sure our children understand better the Constitution, the founding, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, all these things. And I'm always like, federalism, folks. We are the United States of America.
Right.
And it's something that too often I think gets lost. Let's talk about some of those problems attendant with being so dependent on the federal government, because there are issues both at a kind of high conceptual level of what I just mentioned, and then there's issues from a more practical policy making level. And so, I mean, to me, the biggest conceptually is simply, isn't this an example? And I know that states don't often litigate it, but isn't this an example of the federal government busting through its constitutionally delineated, enumerated powers?
Well, absolutely, it is. Like there are things. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution about the federal government helping your school bus system transfer over to electric buses, right? There's just nothing about
insane.
That.
Yeah.
Here's some money, and it buffs up the state budget or the local budget, and they don't do the accounting. This is what bothers me, Kim. Is basic accounting would be, if I take this money, I want the full long-term projection of total spend. And how much of that's going to land on our taxpayers. And in too many states, it's a fundamental part of accounting and economics, and they don't do it. And they get on the hook for long-term pension costs for state employees, for capital infrastructure and upkeep, insurance. Like there's all these costs that make that money not free. But in the moment, it makes the budget look so nice. And so you have states and communities take money for things that they didn't even set out wanting or needing. They just take it though, as if I give you $10 for the worst candy bar of your life, I'm doing you a favor. Don't take the candy bar.
Talk about that some more though, because implicit in this idea, and you just touched on this, is that states seem to believe that by taking this money, it's filling a budget hole. It's money they don't have to pay for. But one of the things that you guys point out in this paper is that because the federal government does things poorly, and because all of the additional rules that are attendant to getting this money, that for the most part, getting federal money raises the cost of doing business in a state. Is that not correct in terms of the long term?
By design. So, often grants will have something called a maintenance of effort requirement, which in a nutshell means, and I understand there's a reason behind it. The federal agency says, look, we're going to give you money to, let's say, help the poor people in your state. Don't you dare turn around and stop spending all the money you were spending already to help the poor.
Right.
So I understand the purpose, but the effect quite often of those MOEs, they're called, is if you figure out innovative new ways to administer welfare in your state, for example. Like the state of Tennessee is a great example. They've done all kinds of really academic-driven experiments to see how do we spend this money to promote entrepreneurship, to promote, full, healthy families, running experiments, trying stuff out. The federal government won't let them spend any of that money on testing what programs work and what don't. They won't let them reduce the spend if they find out a better way to feed families and help people get back to work. Their hands are tied. So it prevents innovation and efficiency by design. And on top of that, often it's pushing communities into spending on things that nobody would have voted for in the first place. And that's what, to me, is crazy, is you're taking money for stuff that your voters didn't even want. And a lot of that driver is going to be the state agency officials. It's not so much of this, there's never even a vote. In most states, state agencies don't even need permission to apply for a federal grant.
Wow.
To accept it. They don't need permission. So you end up with this kind of federal state interface between a bunch of people who nobody voted for. They're deciding all kinds of priorities about how do we live our lives in our communities, how do we run our nursing homes, what do we have in the libraries of our schools, how do we build our roads. It makes no sense, and I think it boils down to lawmakers shirking their responsibility to be the people who decide how their state will be governed.
Okay, so that's actually really scary because we've been talking a lot about all the federal bureaucrats who nobody voted for, who have too much power. But you're essentially saying that in addition, there's a bunch of state bureaucrats that nobody voted for, and those two entities are working with each other to increase federal spending.
Absolutely. That's our group. Part of what we do is we work with state lawmakers to help them flex their oversight muscles on state agencies, because state agencies are a prime vector of federal influence in communities, and they mostly have been understudied.
That's good to know. So another thing you guys talk about in your paper is that all of this money, whether it be grants or other programs that's flowing to the states, it gives the federal government remarkable ability to hold the states hostage to federal agendas.
Okay.
And, you wrote an op-ed for us not so long ago, a couple months ago. You gave one very good example. I think it's probably a relatively small example, but one that would resonate with a lot of Americans, because I knew I grew up with in a 4-H family. But you were talking about how when the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which funds 4-H programs through grants to states' universities, they demanded that every state 4-H program accept the gender identity claims of their staff and volunteers, and they made the money contingent upon that. And you note that not a single state at the time pushed back. How often does this happen, and what are some other examples out there?
Well, under the last administration, that the transgender stuff was like a big part of their agenda, race equity kinds of stuff. So another big push that we saw that's still a problem in thousands of school districts. And this began under Obama, and it was on steroids under Biden. Essentially, Department of Justice and Department of Education sent out joint guidance to every school district that receives any federal funds, which is like all public schools, right? And they said, look, if your rates of suspension and expulsion are different across races for your students, if one race of students is being suspended at a higher rate, we're going to assume that's because of discriminatory practices. And we may or may not show up with a fleet of DOJ lawyers to rake you over the coals. And so the underlying message was, pay attention to the race of the child before you make a disciplinary decision.
Oh my.
And so now we're all hearing about schools out of control, teachers quitting. Well, golly, I bet we know why if we dug in. Thousands of school districts implemented that in one form or another. And now we're paying the price for it. And it wasn't even legally binding in the first place. But they're also afraid of both the muscle of Department of Justice coming in and beating them up, and they're afraid of losing the money. And Kim, the worst part of this is, the saying, he who pays the piper, calls the tune.
Yeah.
Federal government pays for about 14% of local education. They're not even covering the gratuity, and they still get to call the tune with transgender bathrooms and all the other stuff.
Because those districts have come to rely so much on that 14%, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
How is all of this coming to a head just right now in the shutdown? What are we seeing happen to states as a result of the federal closure of its doors?
Well, as it plays out, some of this is it's variable depending on sort of the balance of accounts for any particular state, like how much carryover do they have for whatever funds. But the big deadline we see, of course, will be the SNAP funds. States receive a tremendous amount of money from the federal government to feed people who qualify for food assistance. So that's a big one. And it's going to be a rolling problem because of some provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill that we can get into. But it just mostly depends on the state. Most states have a rainy day fund. Traditionally, they can expect to be reimbursed if they spend out of that to cover these things in the short run, but who knows? So it just sort of depends state by state what they're experiencing right now. Like I have a close friend who, through a Medicaid program, receives in-home health services rather than having to go to the hospital. Well, that's all off the table until they resolve this. So you end up with communities that have allowed things like training for firefighters to be paid for out of federal dollars. Suddenly they can't do those things, or they hired extra firefighters with the federal money. So they get so entwined with federal support that they're incredibly vulnerable, which is the opposite of what our lawmakers are supposed to do. They're supposed to make the community stronger, not make them hostage to, a political game in DC.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. You would like to think that the federal government's inability to deal with its problems would be constrained to Washington, but it's now just radiating across the country because of this entanglement. Well, here's the good news, why I was kind of excited about your paper and the op-ed you wrote for us, is that things are a-changing with the Trump administration there. In some ways, because of Trump administration actions that maybe the states don't love. In other ways, because the Trump administration is actively attempting to work with states to give them more control over some aspects of this. But let's walk through some of those. One big thing, which I think is simply a warning sign, like it's a warning signal to the states, is administration is changing the playbook on, for instance, how grants are handed out of Washington. It's frozen a lot of them. There's a lot of appropriated money that's not going out the door. And that's its own fight that will probably is being picked for purposes of a fight over impoundment, et cetera. But nonetheless, it is making a big difference to the states that rely on those grants and those programs. It's also attaching some of its own strings to grants as well, too, in its own way. How is all of this changing? Are states beginning to understand that there's a lot greater risk here depending on this money than they might have in the past?
I think it depends on the state, and it depends on who you're talking with. I think you're going to face a couple challenges. One is if you were to go to lawmakers and say, you know what, from now on, you're going to need to do a lot more homework before you let a state agency accept a federal grant. They're already swamped. Like they don't have the expertise. And so there's some systems they could build to do better at that, but primarily on the accounting side within their state agency. But I think you're still going to have this incentive for state agency officials to apply for every grant because they can hire people, they can do stuff they want to do with it. My hunch is without significant pain, the short-sighted behavior will continue into the future, when you wave money around. And the strings are a big part of that, Kim, that both parties do this. Congress will say, we want money for this good cause, whatever that is. Agency X, go make it be so. And then Agency X and the ideologues that work there layer in all these strings and conditions that were nowhere in the statute that Congress passed. And then they're calling the shots. They're suddenly, in effect, legislating what will be done with that money. So there's a lot of opportunity for states to begin pushing back on that, even litigating that. But they have to be aware of it first, which means paying attention to these grant agreements that their bureaucrats in their own state are signing.
Well, you talk about some of the things you do say some states are doing this, beginning to take initial steps. Now, one example you cite is Utah, which is simply engaging in some contingency planning, like beginning to think of a world, like what would it be like if we didn't keep getting all of this Washington money? How exactly is that working in Utah? What did they do?
Yeah, well, and they're not the only one, but they essentially requiring their state agencies to come up with a plan. So if the state agency is the recipient of tranches of federal money that are purposed in certain ways, they should have the visibility on how that money is then going out in their communities, whether it's going direct check to recipient or more likely going through NGOs and, let's say, local governments, county governments. So they're supposed to have a point of view on what happens if there's a stoppage for a certain period of time, or if there's complete elimination, or if all the money doesn't come through. So essentially, they have to be ready to say, we're going to cut it off in these ways, or we're going to spend it for a certain period of time out of a rainy day fund. So it's in part understanding what will they pay for if the feds stop, but also understanding where is the federal dollar going once it crosses our state border? Because a lot of the danger is the money percolates out to these entities that are trying to help people, and suddenly you don't know who's going to collapse when the federal spigot turns off for even a month,
Well, that seems to be the big key here. You mentioned that other states, in addition, are simply now beginning to demand a lot more transparency about what is attached to the funding, what they might be required to do. So can you give us some examples of that?
Well, we've had one thing that is important to us, and it ties back to those examples like the 4-H and the kind of race-based school discipline that was pushed under the Biden administration. Agencies increasingly are using something, it's a sub-regulatory practice called federal guidance, which is supposed to be clarification of the rules, right? It's supposed to be helpful. But increasingly what they were doing is saying, well, in our opinion, you have to do this crazy thing that nobody ever voted for, or else you're going to be in trouble. And communities do it.
Essentially a regulation. Correct?
That's exactly what it is. And it's a violation of federal law to do it that way, and they know it, and there's no consequences. So state of Tennessee, state of Oklahoma, and now Utah have all passed laws saying to their state agencies, if you get that stuff, you have to share it with certain members of the legislature. And what that does is it opens up the box, because those agencies, when they're breaking the law, when they're using guidance in that manner that they know is illegal, they're not publicizing that. They're not putting it on their website. They're going directly to the regulated party, like the 4-H state director, and saying, you better do this or else. So these laws require then the 4-H program or whatever it is to share that guidance with their lawmakers and then their AGs, and you can take action. So there's that. But there's still a lot of work to be done like that. It's very nerdy accounting kind of stuff, Kim, but it's kind of the job, I would think, of, our government in our states.
You would think, yes. I mean, they tell us all the time that they are the entity that has the power of the purse, but it would be nice if they actually took that as seriously as they make it sound.
Yeah, just know how many coins are in the purse and where they came from would be a good start.
Exactly, a good start. One thing you also write too, which I found kind of most fascinating, is that you say that some states are now even requiring legislative approval before agencies can apply for or accept federal funds. That to me seems to be the sort of ultimate goal, or what do you think?
Absolutely. And you know what I love about this, because to me, federalism is not a partisan matter. The state with, in my opinion, the gold standard law for requiring this kind of legislative permission and visibility is Oregon.
What?
And I have a colleague who talked to one of the people, the lawmakers in Oregon, who's on that committee, who is a fairly left-wing person, at my understanding, even in Oregon, right? But for this person, they just felt like, look, this is just democracy. That's exactly right. So if Oregon can do it, golly, maybe Texas could, and Florida, and who knows?
Well, that's my next question is, I get really excited about things that happen down at the state level. And, we have the famous saying that the states are the laboratories of democracy. And we've seen how when an idea really gets rolling, it can begin to super spread. I mean, the fun one we've all been watching, just, I never thought I'd see it in my life, is the expansion of school choice, now rippling across the state grounds. We've also seen some really remarkable changes in the tax realm, whether it's income taxes or tax restraint. Are you seeing this? Would you consider this question of state dependency and states beginning to care more about that relationship? Is it something that's like new? Is it something that's become like a new thing that states feel they need to get on board with? Or is it just still beginning to percolate?
What we found when we talk with lawmakers is, especially in things like guidance transparency, it's bipartisan, because they agree we should have visibility. And even if we like the people in the White House right now, the next gang we may not like. So we should have a law like this. So when it comes to the transparency and that sort of thing, we're seeing that it's popular. The question will be, step one is we're gonna put ourselves in position as a legislature or as an attorney general in a state to make sure if some federal bureaucrat is trying to use power inappropriately to force our community to go along with something that nobody wants, we'll be in a position to know about it and litigate it, or just refuse to comply with it. And let's see what happens. The next step, though, and this comes back to the start of our discussion, is at some point, if they're going to take all this federal money, well, they're probably going to find themselves over and over feeling like they've got to do what they're told. And so at some point, they have to decide who is going to make these decisions for our communities. And if we're not going to take the federal money, does that mean we're going to start paying for more things ourselves? And that to me is the bigger hurdle, but that there is no other option. If we don't restrain the federal government to its enumerated powers, we go bankrupt.
This is a perfect ending because this was my last question and you just set it up beautifully. So my question is, how do we, and it's the big picture, how do we really unravel this? Because like you say, in theory, state officials have enormous power to unwind this. And they have every reason to. We just went through all of them. This is corrosive. It's terrible budgeting. It's driving the national government into debt. It costs money in the long run. It takes away a state's ability to make their own decisions. And in theory, if they wanted to, they could just simply begin weaning themselves off of these federal programs and taking back these jobs themselves, arguably doing a much better job at a lower cost. But the problem is the taxation problem, right? Because, for states to take over some of this, and again, arguably do a better job, they'd have to raise their local taxes. And it would be one thing to make that case to their residents if federal taxes were going down. But that seems unlikely, at least for whatever first bold states were going to go out there and do this. So you just end up in a situation where you're saying to residents, please pay higher local taxes and also continue to pay your big federal taxes. So how do we actually really unwind this in the end?
Yeah, you feel like suckers. So step one would be, if you've got better visibility, you stop at least taking the money for the stupid stuff that nobody wanted in the first place.
Okay.
Why do we need to convert our school buses to EVs or whatever? Put solar panels on the top of the office building in Chicago. Cut it out. So that would be step one. I think then step two, it's going to be multi-state action. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we had some sort of arrangement where if the state is willing to take on more responsibility and raise the revenue for it, the taxpayers in that state pay a lower federal tax. Or, you could start sending your people to Washington, you elect them in your state and you move to more of a block grant situation. So at least there's more flexibility at the state level. You can begin to sort of loosen the handcuffs a bit. But I think at some point it's going to be because it's a collective action problem.
Yeah.
You're going to need a sort of a Congress and states agreeing that they're going to shift the tax incidence back the other way, which is quite a lift. So that's why I lead with stop taking money for the bad stuff first, and then we can get to the harder problem.
Okay, small steps. But you know what I love? I love that you still had a plan for how it could be done. So on that very optimistic note, we want to thank you, Tony. We want to thank our listeners. We'll be back next week. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write in with comments, complaints, suggestions, you can at atkim@wsj.com.